Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or so. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Office of Educational Equity webinar series. Today's topic is storytelling as an anti-racism tool to create community. We're looking forward to hearing from our moderator and speakers today. This series was created with the hope that we could foster a learning environment where we can identify ways we play a role in moving toward greater unity and impacting change. As a higher education institution with more than 56% minority students employed across different industries, we hope to provide insight for employers and other organizations on how to actively contribute as an inclusive leader in a culturally complex society. As we move forward with hosting these webinars on the third Thursday of each month, our goal is to inspire employers and organizations to improve diversity through actions in their day-to-day practices, hiring procedures, and approaches to fostering an inclusive culture, because it impacts key stakeholders. Without further ado, we'd like to move forward and introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Krahe, Dean of Research and Innovation at the University of Phoenix. We'll now turn it over to Eve.
Thank you, Tandra. Hello, everyone, and again, welcome to our panel discussion. My name is Dr. Krahe, and I do serve as the Dean of Research and Innovation here at Phoenix. I will be acting as the moderator for our discussion today. And in a moment, I'm gonna ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. But first though, I've been asked to provide a sort of way into today's discussion for you. So just some suggestions about how to kind of mentally access the content and get the most out of it. Storytelling is an ancient way of creating community and connecting to one another. Our conversation today is twofold. We will be introducing storytelling as a tool to be used, but also a discipline to be explored. You'll be treated to practitioner and academic perspectives, best practice in community and corporate settings, and also you may even hear one or two stories, actually. Our group today is expert storytellers, as you all know. So you may hear a story or two as we go on through our conversation. Listen carefully and watch the panelists. They are not only talking about storytelling, but they're modeling how to do it. Listen for the characters, the plot lines, the surprise endings, and underpinning all of this, most importantly, is the central notion of today's conversation. Storytelling as an anti-racist tool to create community. You'll hear our panelists return to this again and again today. So now let's welcome our panelists. Each will introduce themselves to you, telling their own story. And I would love to ask Ms. Rachel Egboro of The Whole Story to start us off. Rachel?
Thank you, Eve. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Egboro, and I am the founder and creator of The Whole Story. On a Saturday afternoon in April, I was at home by myself when I heard a noise on my patio. I poked my head around the corner in time to see a shadow jump over the wall of my patio and crouch in the corner. As I get closer, I see a young man, and he looks at me and he says, "Please don't call the cops. I don't want to get arrested." And I didn't want to call the cops because it was 2016 and we were both Black. And in that moment, Black Lives Matter became very, very real to me. I wondered what would have happened if he had found refuge on my neighbor's patio. Would my neighbor have seen the young, scared man that I saw? Then I also wondered what would happen if he had a chance to tell his side of the story. Would his eloquence be met with empathy? And would the audience be able to see and hear his story and connect with him on a level that was deeper than his skin? So I took that as my call to action, and I partnered with Phoenix Art Museum during the final weekend of the Kehinde Wiley exhibit, A New Republic, in January of 2017. The opening of that exhibit, which puts Black subjects in typically European art scenes, for example, Michael Jackson on a white horse in full suit and armor, that exhibit was the most attended opening exhibit that the museum had ever had, an exhibit that put Black people in spaces that they typically aren't seen. It was a perfect launch for the whole story, which launched to a sold out crowd of over 300 people. And to date, in the past 4 years, over 50 people have shared their stories on love, life, and everything in between. I've had the opportunity to coach people from the community, Black people, on their stories, and it's been a complete honor. Moving into COVID, we recently launched a series called The One-on-One, and our first guest last month was Angelica Lindsay Ali, also known as the Village Auntie and the host of the Moth open mic here in Phoenix. And Angelica said something really wonderful during our conversation where I play a video of her story, and then we get to dive deep into a conversation about her storytelling process. The audience can ask questions, and then we just vibe and have a good time. But towards the end of our conversation, Angelica shared something that I'd like to share with you all. She said, I've been on a lot of storytelling shows, but the whole story was the first time where I was actually going through a story process of curating and designing a story and presenting it to a big audience. Out of all the shows I've done, it is still my most favorite setting because I felt like that was a space for us, by us, and to us. That's a little bit about me and the whole story. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Liz Warren, would you like to go next?
Sure, Eve. Thanks, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be on the panel today. My name is Liz Warren, and I am one of the founders and the director of the Storytelling Institute at South Mountain Community College. Coming up on October 14th, we will be celebrating our 25th anniversary as a Storytelling Institute. And the Storytelling Institute was started at SMCC by a group of faculty and staff because we began to learn that our students learned better when information was presented through story than they did in any other way. And of course, if that was the best way for students to learn, that's what we wanted to be about. So that was the impetus, but we soon learned that storytelling as an activity in itself was a wonderful thing and that we wanted to do it and that we wanted to teach it. And so over time, we developed an academic certificate program. And I think really we were the first higher education institution in the nation to offer the discipline of storytelling at South Mountain Community College. So we've had about 60, 70 people complete our certificates, and we just recently changed up our certificate program to make it a little more nimble for people as well. And that's where we are now, 25 years down the road.
Thank you, Liz. I'll turn it over now to Travis. Travis?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. My name is Travis May. I'm a storytelling faculty member at South Mountain Community College. My role on campus is storytelling and workforce. So I combine what storytelling is into entrepreneurship, business, the work sector, things like that. I've been on campus here for about 20 years now. And actually, I was a student here at South Mountain Community College back in the mid-90s. And they kept me around. I don't know, they must have liked me or something, but I ended up getting a job. And then I started off in the technology world, believe it or not. And then the person who was just before me, Liz Warren, recruited me to be storytelling. And I thought, what in the world is storytelling? Well, ended up taking a class and she kind of took me under her wing and the rest is really history. but it's been a great ride. And so now I feel so fortunate, really, because now I'm teaching students. I'm in the same classroom as I was. I'm teaching, though, in these classrooms. And so I was a student there. So I know exactly how these students feel. So I feel like it's a blessing. I always feel like every day when I'm in the classroom, I'm just paying it forward. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. And Tanya, would you round us out with your intro? You may be on mute.
Gotta
Oh,
unmute.
there you
There's
go.
the story behind that, you know. I could sit and talk for quite some time. Anyway, what I was saying was that I come to the world of storytelling from a business background. I earned a couple of graduate degrees, worked in healthcare for a number of years, and then transitioned into K-8 education, earning my post-bac, and taught second grade, fifth grade, and then I was drafted into teaching technology because I came from corporate America and actually knew how to use some of the software. And the reason I'm telling you that is it was such a wonderful experience, because that's what first exposed me to the power of storytelling, was working with my K-8 students on designing their own games, using, you know, from designing digital games, actually. And what was fascinating was watching them go through that process of trying to find out their identity, their own personal awareness, and projecting that awareness into the creation of a world, essentially, a digital world that they wanted to portray to the rest of their peers. And it was that experience that when I went into higher education, I was determined to bring the world of gaming to faculty in higher education, and have had some tremendous successes in doing that. And so I just wanted to share all that with all of you. That's how I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So that concludes our panelist intros. Just one small housekeeping item. There's going to be a question and answer period following our discussion today. And I would suggest that you type your questions in the chat, and then Saray and Tandra will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation and will address questions at the end. Okay? All right, without further ado, let's begin. Rachel, I'm gonna start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the whole story and how this has promoted and is promoting an anti-racist kind of pedagogy and a way of doing things around storytelling?
Yes, I can do that. So the whole story initially started out as a quarterly event here in Phoenix, starting in January, first Friday in 2017. Each quarter, I would recruit 5 people, 5 different Black people from the community. And these individuals represented all parts of Black life, from the Black diaspora. So we've had people from Panama, people from Atlanta, from Brooklyn, from Phoenix. What I recognized when I created the whole story, I had been telling my own story since about 2013, thanks to the storytelling environment that Liz and the Storytelling Institute helped develop and create in Phoenix. We have this really wonderful vibe of storytelling stages starting and, you know, growing all across the valley. But I recognize that my story doesn't represent all Black people's story. My story is just one part of the whole story for Black lives. And as a Nigerian, as an American, as a woman, I knew that I couldn't fully tell Black stories. And being in a space like Phoenix, where according to the 2010 census, who knows what will happen in 2020, 7% of the population is Black. So it's really easy to go through your daily life without having an interaction with a Black person beyond maybe hearing it through the radio, you know, a playlist, music, seeing some influence on TV. It's really easy to stay comfortable with people that you know and are comfortable with, people who look like you, act like you, kind of stay isolated like that. So the whole story was my attempt to kind of lift up the hood and expose people to Black lives in all of its shapes and forms. And the reason it's anti-racist is because it's explaining the whole story. It's sharing all about Black people, it's sharing our humanity, and it's giving folks who have nothing, who may not have something in common with the people on stage, an opportunity to connect to their stories in a meaningful and natural way. So what that does is lifts the barriers that could happen in society when someone wants to connect with people that aren't like them, and gives them a chance to actually do that. Does that answer your question?
It sure does. Thank you. Thank you. Liz, I'm going to move to you next. Can you help define storytelling for us? And with that, talk about how, as Rachel's saying, how does it help us relate to others as a discipline and a practice?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And Eve, let me start by saying what a story actually is. And a story is a narrative form that documents change. That is its essential function. And we use stories in all sorts of other narrative forms, in speeches, in sermons, in lectures, in TED Talks, but those things are not stories. Those are really lectures. That story, that little narrative unit, it has to document change. And as humans, that's what we're always looking for. We're always trying to find out, well, what's going on here? What is changing? And what does that change mean? And what we've learned from our 25 years teaching storytelling, and then more recently in the academic literature, what's coming out is that storytelling is really adult pedagogy. It is how adults learn. And I'm kind of shocked that as academics and even as humans, we haven't capitalized more on that, which is if we know this is how people like to learn, and more importantly, it's how they learn best. Why aren't we using it more in all sorts of disciplines? But what we've done in the Storytelling Institute for the last 25 years is to not only teach people about storytelling and what it represents for our ancestors and in our cultural backgrounds, and how it's been humans' preferred mode of communication, but we've also engaged them in doing storytelling. Because the only way you can really learn about storytelling is to tell stories to each other. And then when students participate, and of course we teach not only at the college, but we teach in the community as well. So when students, people, whoever, participate in storytelling and they witness firsthand the community that springs up between people who are sharing stories, well, then they really understand what it is. And because SMCC is the most diverse college in the Maricopa Community College District, we've been able to do that specifically within a context of equity and building bridges across races and ethnicities. But you also asked me about how it helps people connect. And I think there's a couple ways that it does that. One is that stories, because we all grew up in an environment of literacy, we think of stories as words, right? But stories really aren't words, stories are pictures. We use words to convey pictures to each other. And when we can convey a picture about our life to another person, that person can see it. And because stories don't just involve pictures, they involve emotions. When you link an image with an emotion and somebody else can literally see something from your life, well, then they have a better chance of relating to it and understanding it. So if you can see it and you can feel it, then you have a chance of understanding it. And the other thing about stories is that stories are vehicles for values. Every single story that anybody tells pulls a little wagon behind it, and that little wagon is filled with values. And when we hear a story from another person that maybe we think, oh, I don't have anything to do with that, I don't know anything about that person or who they are, or where they come from. But we hear a story and we hear values in it that we share, or we see pictures about their lives that relate to pictures that we have about our own lives, then we are more able to care about those people.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. So the little wagon that trails behind a story, I love that metaphor a lot. that wagon can also be used in settings like corporate environments or community environments in order to convey, I would only imagine, a number of things. So in that respect, Travis, I'd love to hear a little bit about your work on the corporate side and how storytelling is utilized as a tool there.
Yes, thank you, Eve. So as Liz was mentioning, storytelling has values in it. And storytelling is really about this horizontal communication piece. Storytelling is really a tool for communication. And the way we can communicate, if we can show the values that we have, we can connect with one another. And there's also lessons learned with using storytelling. So for instance, I'll give an example. Many years ago when I was working in the technology department, had an employee. He had to install this computer lab, and he did it all by himself. 25 computers, installed it, did all the whole operating system. He was so proud of himself, so proud. And then he went to go tell the supervisor. He goes, look, I did this. And he was so proud of it. I did it all on my own. This is great. And I guess the supervisor was like, okay, all right. He was like, what? He was shocked. He was, just okay. So he comes up to me. He goes, hey, I don't feel appreciated. And of course, he went on with this whole thing. I don't feel valued. I did this whole thing by myself. I did it within a week. I'm proud. I go, well, let me tell you a story. And I told him about the story. I said, look, there was 2 Buddhist monks, and they were walking along this path, and they came across this muddy stream. And there was a young lady there, and she didn't know how to get across the stream. She didn't get all muddy. So there was the teacher monk, and there was the student monk. And the teacher monk kind of took off his robe, and he laid it down over that muddy stream. He picked up the young gal, walked over his robe, put her down on the other side, right? The student monk came across, walked on as well. Well, the young girl, she got put down, she just walked off. Didn't say anything, just walked off. Now, the master the teacher put on back on his robe, and they kept walking. And they went on for about 2 to 3 hours walking down this path, just continuing. The student and the teacher monk did not even talk to each other. Then finally, the student goes, stop, teacher, I can't deal with it. I can't deal with it. He's like, well, what's wrong? He goes, that young gal, you picked her up, you laid down her robe, you walked her across, and she didn't even say thank you. She didn't say anything. How rude. Well, the teacher looked down at the student and said, you still thinking about her? I put her down hours ago. And he kept walking. So I told this story because my coworker, he was frustrated. It lasted all day for hours. He was just frustrated how I wasn't valued, how I wasn't appreciated. And I said, sometimes you just got to let it go. Just put it down. And he looks at me and he goes, that's why you're a storyteller. I was like, yeah, but he got it, right? And it was about a lesson learned. And so I said, hey, just forget about it. Let it go. But once I told him a little story, he kind of got it. It made this connection. He was like, oh, I see what you mean now. I could put it down and let it go, and I can keep moving on. I know what I did was valuable. I know what I did was well done. I can just keep walking. And so those are little moments to where, although that's a wisdom story, we would call that, you can use folk tales, you can use myths and legends, because a lot of times nowadays we think storytelling just has to be personal. Well, going back to what Liz said, stories have values. And historically, throughout cultures and history and traditions, they were told stories to pass on values in their culture and their history. So we should never ever forget that storytelling is really about values and how you can pass that along.
Thank you, Travis. Really appreciate that story. And I'll remember it, which I think is a huge part of story in general. The lessons are memorable. Liz, like you were saying, it's this little universe that we can just digest, and understand immediately what we need to understand. So in that same vein of teacher and student, Tanya, I would love to move to you next, because I know your work and the work that I've been partnering with you on is around storytelling in higher ed. And we're seeing increasingly storytelling being trumpeted as a really great practice for educators. So could you tell us a little bit about what's happening in higher ed?
Sure, I'd love to, Eve. One of the things that I want to touch on before I kind of move to what University of Phoenix in particular is doing is that when I went to from teaching K-8 to a large research university that had a very strong, significant online arm, again was to bring in the use of games to help build a rapport among students and between faculty and the students themselves. And one of the ways that we did that was by incorporating, in this one particular class that I'm thinking of anyway, a game called Spent. And if anybody wants to go to it, it's playspent.org. And the purpose of the game was it's a very short game, it's very brief, and it's essentially a little decision-making story where you are pitted, you are a person who is living paycheck to paycheck, and you've got to make several decisions as to how you're going to get through the month on your salary of, I don't recall what it was, maybe $1,000, which obviously is not a lot of money, but it's what unfortunately a lot of folks who are making minimum wage are not necessarily the 1,000, but you know what I mean, doing that. And what we found was when the professor was utilizing this game in the classroom, the students were much more able to empathize with structural poverty, systemic poverty, and the whole idea of, people just need to get another job, or they just need to, do X, Y, and Z, and they can pivot themselves out of poverty. After playing this very short, again, it can be a 5-minute game or it can be a 10-minute game, depending on the decisions that you make. Students were much more able to understand that the statistics that they were reading in their textbook involved much more than just the black and white on the page. It involved real life decisions on prioritizing whether it was a car repair or a medication refill or whatnot. So that was a fantastic introduction for a lot of our faculty at that point to realize the power, because a lot of the discussions were much more rich and much more in depth. And so what we're doing at the University of Phoenix is, because we use a lot of practitioner faculty, we want them to bring in their real world experiences and make those relevant and agentic and authentic for students. We want them to contextualize the concepts, theories, and principles. And so by helping instructors, and I don't necessarily mean that they'll be using games, but by helping them realize that the power and the impact of storytelling is really making that connection with their students. Eve and I and Liz Warren and South Mountain are in the beginning throes of starting a pilot on the impact that faculty can have by using stories and anecdotes and narratives in their classrooms.
Thank you, Tanya. Richa, I'd like to return to you and ask you for your insight on storytelling and cultivating leadership, important traits of leaders. Could you talk a little bit about that?
You said Rachel?
Yes.
Okay, storytelling and leadership, sure.
Yep.
Well, one thing about telling your own story is that it helps you establish your place in the world. It builds your identity, it builds your way of expression. A lot of us storytellers say that in order to help other people tell their stories, you need to learn how to tell your own story. And that's something that I practice, and with my storytellers, not only on the whole story stage with Black people, but also with leaders that are local. I coach a lot of business leaders, nonprofit leaders in their events to incorporate personal storytelling into their fundraisers and luncheons and things like that. And one thing that I like to ask people when I'm working with them is, what's a story about you and your background that would surprise people? One thing about leaders is they often bend to sharing about their wins, their accolades, their professional awards. But, not everyone wants to read or listen to what's on your bio or what's on your resume. For me, part of storytelling and leadership is whetting someone's curiosity about where you've been, where you're going, and where you've come from, where you've been. So I always ask them, what's a story that isn't on your resume? What's something that people haven't heard about you that would surprise them? And then that's when we really get into the fun storytelling and leadership, because they're able to dig into their past or a certain situation and find the reason for where they are now. And that's what really gives other folks hope, especially young people. You know, I'm a young working professional, and so hearing someone who's gone before me and hearing the process and the development and what they've done to get to where they are, lessons learned, it's allowing me to take notes and slowly recognize what I can apply to my own process and to my own life and to my own career.
Thank you. You know, Rachel, when we were getting ready to do the webinar, I had started to tell a story, and you said the storytelling coach in me wants to know why, you know, why are you telling this story? And it prompts you to just pull insight out of, you know, who knows where the deep recesses of yourself, and talk about why you think the way you do or why you tell a particular story. And that's the beauty of the coaching. I think it's just really incredible for leadership. Thank you. Liz, I'm going to move to you next. And because what Rachel has said has prompted me to remember something that you said, which is individuals who say they cannot tell stories and that they're horrible storytellers are often the best storytellers. And I was wondering, you know, if you could shed some light for us on perhaps those of us who have some fear around storytelling and sharing, you know, parts of ourselves that maybe we aren't so comfortable with right now, or maybe never.
I'd be happy to, and I'm going to make a link to something that that Rachel was talking about with leaders, and how they're often just asked to talk about their accomplishments rather than things that may be more personal to them. And that is that storytelling does require a willingness to be vulnerable, and to talk about the times when maybe things didn't go exactly the way that you hoped they would. Because storytelling, as I mentioned before, is based in change. It's about what did you do when something didn't work out right. So if you talk about your accolade and don't talk about the struggle that was involved in achieving that, then you don't really have a story. You have a list, and it may be a very impressive list, but it's really not a story. But to get back to what you were saying about people who think that they don't have stories, and of course we hear that all the time in our classes and when we do trainings in the community. Well, I don't have anything to talk about. I don't have anything interesting to share. But what we've learned over the years of doing this, and I imagine Rachel could say the same thing, is that oftentimes the experiences that seem the most quote unquote everyday are the ones that have the most capacity for connecting with listeners. So I may really enjoy hearing a story about how somebody, you know, climbed Kilimanjaro and then came back down. I mean, I assume they came back down after they went up. I may really enjoy that story in the moment, but I have never climbed Kilimanjaro, and I never will. Right? I can barely make myself climb up South Mountain, which is behind my house. So, but when I hear a story about something that has, like I said, an everyday thing about somebody's experience with their grandmother, or a time when they came back from a struggle, or even a story about, you know, funny things that happened when they had a flat tire on the freeway and how they got out of that. We can relate to those. We can build community more readily through those everyday stories. So when people say, I don't have anything to tell, I say, yes, you do. You know, if you're past the age of 10, you have changed. You've experienced challenges and you've responded to them. And every time you do that, that's the story.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz, I want to pull out this idea of vulnerability and connecting. And Travis, I'm going to move to you next. Can you talk a little bit about storytelling and team building?
Yes, but going with vulnerability, that's definitely a huge piece. And when we're talking about storytelling, building teams, it's really getting to know each other. Because oftentimes we may work with people, we may see them every day, but do we actually know where they're from or why do they do what they do? So kind of what Rachel was mentioning is the why story. Why did you come to this institution? Why did you come to work at this place? What do you value? What do you like? What do you enjoy? Kind of understanding those aspects helps us relate to those individuals a lot better. And there's times where I've worked throughout my career. Like you don't really get to know people sometimes. And so to really take the time, and especially when you're working with a team environment and a team that you work with on the daily basis for the most part, if you can really get to know them, so why did you come to this place of work? What drove you? What's your passion? What drives you? Things like that. And also too, I think for building teams, there's 3 stories that I figure that every team member should have, and perhaps even leaders should have. And the first one is the why story. Why do you do what you do? The second one is a lesson learned story. Do you have a story that you learned that perhaps you made a mistake, right? And you learned from that. Those are really, really good because it makes people feel we're all human, right? We all make mistakes. And so instead of someone making a mistake in your team and chastising them, you know, you can understand where they're coming from. Well, I made this mistake, blah, 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 and I learned from it. And that's a little bit better. So we're not perfect. So we've all done that. So we probably can pull a story from that. And then is there a story about teamwork? Maybe a teamwork about success. What have you done as a team that you all work together that you can share as a team? You know, so-and-so did this, we did this, and it was a success. And so for me, my why story, as I got into teaching, when I first started teaching 10, 12 years ago, as far as storytelling, I wasn't really comfortable with it. I got in the classroom, I was scared to death. I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I think I'm just gonna read the textbook. That's probably the best idea. And so, but what happened was one of my first classes I had, my students, they had to tell 4 stories within the semester, 4 stories. I had to tell a folktale story, a myth, a legend, a fact-based story, and the last one is a personal story. And of course, people always freak out because it's a form of communication. You have to get in front of your class, but it's about building this culture of being safe. It's a safe space. So that's the number one thing. And in a team environment, you have to build a safe space. Well, after the class, I went through the first day. This young gal came up to me. She was probably 18, 19, and she was crying in tears, like sobbing. And I thought, oh my goodness, did I just offend her? Like, what did I say? What did I do? And she goes, Mister, I can't tell stories. I can't do it. Not going to happen. I'm going to drop your class. And I thought, oh my God, first, no way, don't do it. So I started talking to her and I kind of helped her off the ledge. At least I thought I was. And I talked to her about 20, 25 minutes. And when she left the class, she kind of was walking with her head down. I thought, man, she is going to drop my class. That pep talk did not work. I don't know what the heck happened. Well, the next class period, she was the first one there. She came about 15, 20 minutes early as I was setting up. And I thought, whoa. And she came in, she sat down. She did not say a word to me. And I didn't say anything to her. I just greeted her. Well, as the semester went on, she told her first story was a folktale. And she told it in about 7 minutes. Her second story was a legend story. That was about 10 minutes. Her third was fact-based. That was about a 10 to 12 minute story. And then her personal story was about 25 minutes long. And I was blown away. And she told a story of why she had a fear of public speaking and talking. Because growing up, she had a stepfather that abused her, verbally and physically abused her. And she felt like she didn't have a voice. She felt like she couldn't be seen or be heard. And that this class that she was taking, the storytelling class, helped her break that facade of who she was or who she thought she was. And she became better for it. And when she was telling this story to the whole class, there was not a dry eye in there, me included. I was looking for the tissue. I think I wiped my shirt. I mean, it was an emotional moment. And everyone really in the class got up and they gave her a hug. And I thought, man, that's teaching right there. Like, they got it. That was my why moment. So from that day on, it really changed the whole perspective of why I teach and do what I do. Because I'm helping change people's lives and their idea of who they think they are to move forward. And storytelling really is that platform, that tool that gives people that voice.
Thank you, Travis. I'm just watching the chat peripherally out of the corner of my eye, and I did notice that someone said, Travis, that they love that your responses are stories. And you know, and for those on the webinar, you know, we did say at the outset of this that the idea is that storytelling is presented as a practice, but it's also going to be modeled. So that's why you're hearing the stories that you are. I think next I'd like to go to you, Liz, and kind of riff on what Travis has just shared about the student. Can you tell us a little bit about storytelling as a tool for personal change? Kind of what that looks like, and if you're teaching someone how to do it, how do you encourage that type of transformation through story?
I'd be happy to. Something I think about all the time. I think anybody who works in storytelling thinks about it all the time because we see it happening again and again and again. First, I'd like to direct attendees' attention to a link that was put in early on in the webinar to a couple of documents that we wrote for the Vitalist Health Foundation a couple years ago. One of them is a storytelling toolkit, and the other one is a policy brief called Storytelling as a Catalyst for Change. And in that policy brief, you'll see a couple of handy diagrams that shows what happens to a person when they tell a story and how that can lead to change, but also what happens to a person when they listen to a story and how that can lead to change. But for us as individuals, to tell a story, we have to understand what it means. And that means understanding the change, right? Because a story always has to do with change. So oftentimes we know we have a story to tell. We know it's something important, but it's not until we craft it to prepare to tell it to other people that we really understand its impact on our life. I've had this experience many, many, many times, and I'm willing to bet that Travis and Rachel could tell you similar stories. But several years ago, I was getting ready to tell a story, a Christmas story, for the Arizona Storytellers Project, and the story I'd wanted to tell for a long time. And I was working with my coach, and it was about. I mean, it was so prosaic. Talk about something that's very everyday. It was a memory I have of a Christmas when I was 10 years old, when I thought I wasn't going to get the present that I wanted. Well, in the telling of the story, I was still seeing it from my 10-year-old's point of view. I was still mad at my mom. I mean, I was 55 at the time, so, or maybe 60. I mean, it was many years after that Christmas. And my coach helped me see that surely it wasn't about that anymore now that I was 60 years old. And so I had to work that through before I could tell the story, but that's always the case. Unless we know what it means, unless we know the change that story represents to us, we are not ready to tell it. And it also doesn't mean that doesn't change over time. We can tell a story and understand it when we're 30 years old. And then when we're 40, maybe we get different understandings of what that means. But that gets back to why storytelling is pedagogy for adults, about how adults learn. When we tell ourselves stories about our own experiences, we are concretizing the learning. We're bringing the learning to consciousness and saying, oh, that's what I learned from that.
Thank you very much, Liz. We have about 2 minutes left. And
do you mind if I ask a question?
Oh, yep, go ahead, Rachel.
So Travis, I know you're the corporate storyteller. So thinking about this moment and this summer and all the corporate statements that came out about diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically around Black Lives Matter, how do you think they told their stories? Who told them well, who didn't? Any thoughts or advice that you could give for corporations who want to make similar statements but might learn from those that have gone before them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what I look for, especially in what's happening right now in our country and even around the world with COVID, but it's really about seeing it from someone's point of view. And storytelling really gives that, because I think too many times we're too quick to judge individuals, to say, you look different than me, or you're from this community, or you're from this neighborhood, or you look like this. And we just kind of throw it away, like, no. But I always feel like if you can hear someone's story about where they came from or why they do what they're doing, it's hard to really hate them. And that's what I look for. I look for that connection of that human quality to say, wow, they're a human being too. I don't have to agree with them, but I can at least see what they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. And so those are the stories I really look for, is, what brings them to that point? What's the whole narrative behind that? And so looking at, you know, the Black Lives Matter, and even with that whole movement, it's just listening to that and what's going on. And I see too many times, in my opinion, we're really too quick to judge. So when I look for stories, it's really about trying to connect with people, and it's really that non-judgmental part. It's a hard thing to do. And we're human beings, we judge a lot, and we're quick to judge. So if we can set that aside and just look at who they are and why they're doing what they're doing, for me, that's where I feel like the real connection comes in. And as I mentioned, you might not agree with it, that's totally fine. But at least as a human being, I could see you for you, and then perhaps you could see me for me.
Thank you, Travis. So we are going to start our question and answer period with the audience now. And I see we have, there's questions in the chat. We have questions coming through. What I want to begin, I believe it was Carol who had a hand raised. And the question there was around, Carol, tell me if I get this right, why story to address race and racism, is that correct? You can type it in the chat if you're unable to speak on the mic. I think that's what I heard. So let's go with that. We'll go with that question. Rachel, I would love for you to take this one because of your deep expertise and the work that you're doing and have been doing in this area. Can you talk about story as a way to address racism and race issues?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, and Karen said, why story is a vehicle to explore race and racism.
There it is. Thank you.
So I think a lot of times, you know, there's an ebb and flow in these moments. There was a big push in 2016, there's a big push in 2017. But when we're talking about anti-racist work, anti-racism, we're really talking about countering a narrative that is embedded in the policies of our country. It's embedded in the way that people receive loans for businesses and people who don't. So when we're talking about anti-racism, we're talking about telling stories and being people who recognize racist practices and live their daily lives in counter to them. I recognize that I myself have racist tendencies. Every one of us do, especially for those who have grown up in America. It's just embedded in us and in the culture and in the way the stories are being fed to us. Someone mentioned Princess and Frog and some of the racist ways that Tiana the princess was characterized as poor, you know, not having a lot of opportunity. That's racist. So what we can do when we're talking about anti-racism and telling stories is framing that was one individual story. That's not the whole story. One person's experience doesn't represent all of Black people's experience, all of Latino, Latinx people's experience. Like Travis said, get to know that individual for them. If you want to get to know a whole race, then tell us more. Liz, tell me more about what it is to be a white person. Liz can do that for Liz, but not for all of white people. So really it started to think less about people as a whole and start thinking more about that person as an individual, as a whole person. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So there were a few questions that came in from the Q&A here in Zoom. One question that I want to bring up first here, and Liz, I think this is probably one for you, and Rachel, potentially you as well. We'll see. It's a kind of around a privacy issue. So Artina asks, I was wondering, as sometimes privacy can be an issue, would it be one-sided, meaning that privacy only concerns the speaker, or would it be you who are speaking about it? And in that vein, she said, I want to know basically if I can tell a story about someone else, or if I should be concerned if my story is being told without my permission. And she said, I should add, I am a Black woman. Mm-hmm. So Liz, I'd like to start with you on this one because of the discussions you've had around privacy, you know, and who can tell what story, and then Rachel will move to you.
Yeah. Yeah, as it happens, this is something we deal with explicitly in our classes, which is that we specifically ask people to respect people's privacy. So if someone chooses to share a story about themselves, then that story stays in that room unless you have the explicit permission of the person who tells it. So it'd go like something like this: Rachel tells a story and I'm just like dying to tell my husband about it. So I go to Rachel and I say, Rachel, may I tell that story to my husband? I know he would find it fascinating. If Rachel says yes, within those parameters, you may share it with your husband, then I may, right? But she didn't give me permission to tell it to Travis or to put it on Facebook, right? But even more importantly, if Rachel says no, then I say, okay, thank you, and I walk away, right? But another part of it has to do as well, and this is our job as coaches, is to help people share stories. When you share it in a public setting, like on the Whole Story or at the Arizona Storytellers or a public event, you're making a decision that you're ready to share that story publicly. That's where the vulnerability comes in. And then the coach's job, of course, is to make sure that you're really ready and that you're really safe doing that. And then as far as telling stories about other people, public people, I mean, there's so many out there. So if I want to tell a story about Michael Jordan, I can look up a ton of resources online and I can tell a story about Michael Jordan. But for a private person, someone that you know, you must have their permission to tell that story about them.
Thank you, Liz. Rachel.
Great. Yeah, that's great, Liz. Exactly. If you're sharing a story on a public stage, for example, the Whole Story, that's a platform developed for Black stories and Black people. So I wouldn't put anyone on that stage if I knew that they weren't ready to tell that story. In the coaching process, we go through about 2-3 months of coaching and workshops, one-on-one and collectively as a group. I've had to tell them, this story isn't ready, let's tell something else. Tell a story that you've told elsewhere, because it's my job to make sure that you feel good when you get off that stage and tell that story. Liz also brought something up about ethical consent. When you ask someone if you can retell their story. Someone in the chat, Adam, brought up telling other people's stories as a white male. One, I would ask, how can you give those other people of color, the tools to tell their own stories within your story? Or when you're retelling their stories, clearly retell and state that you are quoting them word for word. Don't change it, because a lot of times what we've experienced, especially in the media, is our stories are filtered through a white gaze. And so it's not told accurately. And I think about what happened with Botham Jean and Amber Geiger. Mm-hmm. He was murdered innocently in his apartment, chilling on his couch. And the first story that came out was there was some weed on him. He was innocently sitting at home when a woman came in thinking it was her apartment and shot him because she thought it was her apartment. But the story that came out criminalized him first, until we learned he was a really sweet, innocent man who loved to sing in his church choir. Why wasn't that story told first? These are the racist policies that we must address in the way that we tell our stories.
Thank you.
Eve, can I address something that we were talking about earlier about how do we specifically deal with racism? And I want to talk about what happens in our classes and what can happen when we can bring people together in a safe environment to share stories with each other over time. And that's how we specifically deal with racism at South Mountain Community College. It's in our classes. Because our college is so diverse, our classes are almost always majority Hispanic and African American students. And sometimes some international students, and sometimes some students of European ancestry. It's usually a great mix in there. And then what happens is over the course of the semester, as they choose a cultural story to tell, as they choose a fact-based story to tell, and then ultimately a personal story to tell, they build trust in the group. They begin to see each other as individuals. They make connections with their own lives. And then they build, in short, they build community. And they can see themselves, whatever their background is from, as part of at least the community of that classroom for the period of that time. Students tell us again and again and again that having that experience of connecting with people that they thought were different from them then influenced how they were able to function in the broader world.
Thanks, Liz. And I would add that the scientific literature echoes that. You know, we see that when individuals are engaged with the humanities, of which story is one type, we see an oxytocin response in the brain, serotonin, and you know, empathy and all that. So there are even chemical markers for how great of a tool this is, you know, connecting people. All right, I'm going to return to the questions. We have about 2 minutes left or so. I'm going to go with, let's see, Anthony. What is a good way of encouraging people to share their story without making them feel pressured or uncomfortable? Travis, would you take this one?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the keys is that vulnerability with yourself. You have to be willing to open up yourself. So it's hard to actually tell people, to direct people, hey, tell your story, whether maybe I haven't told mine yet. And so I think that's a huge piece of it, is go ahead to be vulnerable yourself. You know, talk about, if it's a workplace environment, well, maybe you can tell your why story or your lesson learned, or maybe you could tell where you're from. So opening up yourself kind of gives people the open door a little bit. And that's very helpful, that I found out. And even in our storytelling classes, I have to be willing to open up day one. I mean, I let them know who I am, where I'm from, my why, my things like that, because I'm trying to set the stage for my students to open up as well. So it's about creating that safe space. And that's definitely one of the reasons on how to do that. It's hard to really tell people, okay, tell me where you're from. And they're like, what? What's going on? You know, so as someone who wants to take that leadership role into that, it's being willing to open up yourself and to be honest. And I think that's one of the things of storytelling, is being genuine, because people can seek out that you're fake, that you're not honest, but being truly genuine is a huge part of it. And storytelling, when we're talking about oral storytelling, it's a whole package. So if you're speaking to someone one-on-one, it's about your body language, your eye gestures, your all that. You know, and everyone knows when you're sitting like this and, yeah, I like working here. No, that doesn't work, right? And so we have to really be mindful. That's just communication package. You know, it's our body language. It's the way we have our tone and the way we have feeling into what we say. And the words are really the smallest amount of it. It's how we present it as our body language and the way we say things. So that's a huge piece. And so that's where the vulnerability really comes in as well. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you. Tanya, I have one here for you, and then I think we're going to close it up so that Saray can wrap us up and bring us home. Tanya, can you tell us a little bit about how online faculty can incorporate storytelling best? And I think this relates to online environments in general, now that we're all working on Zoom, you know. How can online faculty incorporate storytelling best?
There are a number of different ways. I mean, obviously, I gave the one example of using a game like Spent or Dyspia or Dragon That Cancer or That Dragon Cancer. There's a ton of other games that you can utilize as well that bring in the whole idea of empathy, and sort of, to get to someone else's point, sort of lead people to be a little bit more comfortable with sharing their responses. For example, That Dragon Cancer is a simulation game, or it's not really a simulation, it's really more of a storytelling game, actually, that goes through one father's ordeal when his small child his 4-year-old had cancer and ultimately died from it. And I think that would be a fantastic way to, if you're in social and behavioral sciences, for example, or nursing, to introduce the whole idea of people's mourning. And, you know, what does mourning look like for Joel, the fellow in the game, and what does it look like for you as a person? So there's that can engage. There's also the use, just like we are right now on Zoom, of using video. To encourage folks to share stories, comment on stories, you know, and just do that whole sharing. There's also journaling, which can be done, you know, obviously between an instructor and a student, and or it can be shared with the class if it's a blog of some sort. So there's so many different ways. It just really depends on what the comfort level of the instructor is and of those students. I think it's always, as Travis and Rachel and many others pointed out, making sure that you have the buy-in of the students and are respecting their privacy and everyone's privacy at that point. So,
thank you, Tanya. Okay, with that, Saray, I'm going to turn it back to you, Saray and Tandra. And thank you, everyone. What a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Eve. We would love to extend our thanks to all of our panelists. It was such a great discussion, and thank you, Eve, for moderating this so beautifully. Before we end, I would like to share with all of you the Educational Equity webinar series is a prime example of how important it is to have leadership supporting issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Active leadership engagement is crucial to bring these equity and inclusion efforts to fruition and properly embed them within an organization, policies, procedures, and strategic goals. So we want to thank all of you for joining us today. You will be receiving an email with a link to the recording as well as contact information from our speakers. I saw a few requests on there that you will all be really booked up in the next few months with some speaking engagements. And we would love for you to sign up for our webinar coming up next month, October 15th, and on Latinx leadership. So with that said, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our great speakers, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.